Spyro the Dragon from the very beginning was a game based on the splendor and simplicity of its worlds, ideas, characters, and concepts. And as it made its way into the limelight further and further, Spyro flew high and in time flew free. But just like Icarus from ancient Greek mythology, in some ways he flew a little too close to that light, which, as longtime fans of the series will know, eventually led to the purple dragon falling from grace and falling out of popularity as he ended up in obscurity for many years. Eventually though, the day came when his popularity was revitalized with Skylanders for the next generation, as well as with the reignited trilogy for those of us who grew up on the original games, and for those of this generation who may want to crack at a new platform that isn't Mario or Sonic. And with Spink the Dink on the rise once again, I personally want to see him stick around for as many years as possible. So with that said, I want to make a claim in the sand today in this very video on what I believe Spyro 4 as well as future titles should look to incorporate if and only if Activision intends to keep this franchise flying high. That said, if you do go on to enjoy this video in any capacity, it would be amazing to leave the video a like as it helps the channel out a ton. Also, definitely let me know what you think about it in the comments below, as well as feel free to share your own opinions about any missteps the series has made since its inception. With all that out of the way, let's talk Spyro. Starting off, one of the biggest complaints about Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon is its reliance on extra playable critters to explore different avenues for gameplay. This is a fair critique because frankly having one per homeworld can be really iffy, especially when their inclusion involved things like backtracking to levels from the previous hub, like with Sergeant Bird and Molten Crater, Bentley and Bamboo Terrace, and Agent 9 and Fireworks Factory respectively. To some, this aspect of backtracking may seem like a solid reason to revisit old levels, but oftentimes comes across as a lame excuse to trek through a level for a second time, just to collect an extra couple of gems and an egg in most cases. Of course, in Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, this was present in a similar capacity because of the abilities. But for the areas and minigames you access with those abilities, you can at least still play as Spyro rather than need to take on a whole new character. However, as Spyro speedrunners have proven, you don't necessarily need all the abilities to access these areas, as the majority of these backtracking requirements in Spyro 2 especially could be bypassed through some exploits in the gameplay and subsequent parts of each level's environment. These exploits would allow for some interesting routing decisions to skip the backtrack, and would allow you to skip things like buying swim or climb to access areas and whole sections of the homeworlds. And not that everybody wants to zoom through a game like a speedrunner, but more often than not, these things come across as a chore to most players. And some would argue that the majority of the alternate playable characters, Agent 9, Sergeant Bird, and Bentley, were considerably less fun to play compared to the gameplay of the namesake Purple Dragon. So yeah, my first thing would definitely be to say avoid backtracking, if at all possible, everywhere possible. Speaking of things we should avoid revolving around characters, is the fact that we should grow the cast some, but not too much. For example, we could use a handful of new faces to accompany the old and returning cast. However, we shouldn't dig too deep beyond cameos for those reoccurring faces. The only characters I can realistically see making an exception for are like Laura and Hunter, very similarly to their roles in Spyro 2 and 3, but maybe a little more so. Especially for Laura, she just deserves more, man, come on. That said, on the topic of returning characters, one character I definitely would vouch for is having Cynder from the Legend of Spyro series make her debut as a playable character in Spyro 4. And I say debut because she's never actually been in the original timeline. She could play as something akin to how Coco is playable in the Crash series in place of her brother. Alternatively, if they did give her some unique abilities to make her gameplay unique to itself, that could really make for some fun in my opinion. However, outside of those three, when it comes to returning faces, I think they should primarily be relegated to cameos. For example, having a level with some posters of Sergeant Bird as a war hero, or maybe some characters from Skylanders being referenced here and there with signs or statues. This would be plenty as a nice nod to the past of the franchise without needing to overextend into the overlying game too much. That said, I don't think we should stop with characters there. In fact, I believe that we should introduce at least one new character, as realistically, I feel that we need new in a new game. Seeing as if Spyro is to enter the modern age as more than just a pure nostalgia act, we definitely need something new to spice it up, which I personally think would be best served with us getting a brand new villain. Now, I'm probably going to bring this up in several videos in the future, as well as this one here again, but I would really like to see whoever's making the game show the player a little bit of respect. And what I mean by that is I want them to give us a villain that has a little bit of depth to them at the very least. Frankly, I believe we need a truly engaging villain for the story of Spyro 4. However, I will explain later on why respecting the player is super important to the future of this franchise. However, to create an engaging villain, it can be done a few different ways. Namely, we could have a super charismatic villain with wisecracks and generally witty dialogue similar to a Loki from Marvel Comics, and more specifically from his time in the MCU under Tom Hiddleston. Now you might be thinking to yourself, Dylan, what's wrong with the villains we've had in Spyro so far? Well, this might be a bit of a controversial take, but I don't really think they're anything special. Nazi is fine, but lacks any real threat due to his depictions in the games. Ripto is iconic, sure, but I have issues with bringing him back considering he literally fell in lava at the end of the game. And before you mention it, yes, I know he came back in Enter the Dragonfly, but look how well that went for that game. And yes, the Sorceress technically did the same thing at the end of Super Bonus Round after achieving 117%, but at least they showed her kind of getting out of the lava at the end of the first fight's cutscene. I'll probably make a proper video about it at some point, but Spyro seriously has had a ton of problems with making really good villains. So personally, I'd like to see a properly threatening and maybe even charismatic big bad with real and maybe even understandable reasons for being evil at the helm as the primary antagonist for Spyro in Spyro 4. I just think it would be an amazing inclusion and would likely help interest fans new and old. Now this next part I call simplicity is key, as another key way to entice fans new and old is to focus on the core fundamentals of what makes Spyro good for completionists, speedrunners, and even just casuals alike. Meaning you keep the game the same if not similar to how the collectibles and general gameplay was handled in the original trilogy. I say this because, simply put, it wasn't broken, so why fix it? The stuff they did with the gems in A Hero's Tale was fine, but the radical changes in A New Beginning from the Legend series did throw me for a loop. Mind you that in hindsight, I do really enjoy how things in A New Beginning and A Hero's Tale were handled, but in my honest opinion, it takes away from the sense of completing the game in the ways that the older titles just nailed. I finished the level and felt like I actually accomplished something. It's a simple and quality formula. Take Purple Dragon, add gems, add collectible, add optional other collectible, and bada bing, bada boom, you have a quality game. Well, obviously it's not that simple, but it's not that complicated either. Like I said, we could use that quality baddie to help improve an aspect of the game that's otherwise lacking. But if you were to keep the core of the game the same and further add purpose to those collectibles, the potential for Spyro 4 to be the best Spyro game of all time just goes through the roof. So rather than reinventing the wheel, I think that Spyro 4 should add to the wheel. For example, maybe you collect 20 collectibles of some kind and it gives you a super jump for the rest of the game. Or maybe it unlocks different breath attacks. Anything to change up the gameplay and maybe give us some other things to do while still maintaining the core of the game. Anything to change up the gameplay and maybe give us some other things to do while still maintaining the core of the game. This needs to be done without relying too heavily on those features as a crutch though, as they should realistically be used to improve the core gameplay. A little side note, but while I adore Spyro 3, the biggest problem with it is how much it ignores the core gameplay in favor of some pretty questionable minigames. So while I love Spyro skateboarding or tolerate playing whack-a-mole as Bentley or any of the other multitude of minigames in that game, they do take you out of the gameplay a lot compared to the streamlined way Spyro 1 feels. Heck, even Spyro 2 has this problem with minigames like Calyx, which is especially terrible in Reignited by the way, and the terrible trolley minigame which regrettably was used on repeat in Dragon Shores, despite how unfun the auto-scroller in Breeze Harbor was to begin with. My point is to focus on Spyro and make his gameplay as enjoyable as humanly possible, while keeping minigames to extend playtime to an absolute minimum if used at all. I'm not saying they can't exist, but just make sure you're using the gameplay to do them. Things like the Thieves Crater and Molten Crater I think are perfectly fine because you're using the Supercharge, which is just an extension of one of Spyro's abilities. If they do just that and other things like that, I think that would just be great. Now, this last reason I have is admittedly a facet of what I love to see in a game rather than what the game necessarily needs. But nevertheless, I do believe it would improve the quality of the title if implemented. That thing I love is when a publisher takes its player base seriously. I told you I'd bring it up again. Both in a narrative sense for, let's say, the story of Spyro 4, but also its presentation as a game. Now, it goes without saying that the reignited trilogy only sold as well as it did due to the massive nostalgia pop, which propped the game in front of many fresh eyes. So to capitalize on that further in a new adventure, you should continue the trend of appealing to your older demographic, who experienced the original releases of Spyro on the PlayStation. These are the people who will continue to push it on their live streams and YouTube channels so that more and more eyes will inevitably see the game. And the number one and best way to do this is to have a game with a fulfilling story as well as top-notch gameplay. I know what I'm saying here is pretty much just make a good game, forehead, but I really think it's that simple. You treat your players seriously and give them a really good entry to a series they have nostalgia for, and you have an easy hook for them going forward. Meaning more fan art, more streams, more YouTube videos, and more exposure for the series as a whole. For example, take a good look at Crash Bandicoot 4, which is arguably the best entry to the Crash series since the original trilogy. And some people might even go as far as to say it's the best Crash game, full send. People loved it, and it's done exceptionally well in terms of sales because of that. This is ultimately both because people wanted a new Crash game for years, and because the game itself is just a quality project that took its clients seriously. So if Spyro were to take steps in the same direction, it goes without saying that the possibilities are endless for our Purple Dragon and friends. Anyways, these are just some of the things I believe Spyro 4 could do to succeed as the next title of the rekindled franchise. That said, I'm curious on what you agree with and what you disagree with in this video. Oh, and what do you think I left out? I'd love to know if you want to leave a comment down below. I know we all want what's best for Spyro, so it's only appropriate for me to ask for your opinions on what you think will lead to a long-lasting legacy for Spink the Dink. And hey, if you did enjoy this video and the discussions it brought up, it would genuinely mean a ton to me personally if you'd consider leaving the video a like, as it helps the channel out a bunch. Seeing as it basically tells YouTube that they should recommend this video to others who may be interested in seeing the return of the dragon. Oh yeah, and if you want to see more Spyro videos in the future, be sure to subscribe because those are on the way. That said, for this video at least, I think I'm gonna dip. As always, I hope you stay safe and be bold, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.